Then. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry about the delay, but we will get started. So this is going to be a two-part series discussing the Torah of Rav Kalonymous Kalman Shapiro, who was known as the Eish Kodesh after the work that was published in his name after he died. He was the Piaseczno Rebbe. Let's do a little bit of background on what this is about, and then share a couple of the Drashos, learning together about what he expressed in the Warsaw Ghetto. Rav Kalonymous Kalman was as I mentioned, his father was the Piaseczno Rebbe. His father died when he was a young man, and the Rebbe, the Rav Shapiro, was 3 years old when his father died. At the time he was 20, he had taken over for his father as the Rebbe of Piaseczno. It's actually a whole story. He had originally moved to a different town where he had been educated. There was going to be some debate whether or not he should become the Rebbe there. And in deference to the previous Rebbe, he went back to his hometown. But when he went back to his hometown became bigger than whatever other place which he might have actually become the Rebbe in. And that's where his Hasidim were. Right after World War I, he moved his Hasidim to Warsaw. So even though he's known as the Piaseczno Rebbe, he lived in Warsaw. That's where most of his Hasidim were as well. Warsaw, of course, was the capital of Poland, the center of Jewish life as well in Poland. By the time he was in his early 30s, 10 years into his tenure as a Rebbe, he already had big plans. He was not simply dealing with his Hasidim. He saw a major problem in the Jewish world, and that was a problem of assimilated or uninspired Jews. It's not new to 2020. This is an old story amongst the Jewish people, and he saw that the Jews around him, the young Jews, were either uninspired or absolutely assimilated. And he set out to create a program that was going to reinvigorate Jewish life. And he published a work called the Chovas HaTalmidim, the obligation of the students, which was aimed at inspiring the next generation. It was actually broken down into 3 components of this work. It's a very popular work. It's been reprinted many times until today. It's still being translated into various languages, into English as well amongst them. The first section is in which he addresses parents and teachers, trying to inspire the parents and teachers how to be better parents and teachers to raise the next generation of children. The middle section is actually addressed to a 12, 13, 14-year-old young man in yeshiva. And it's noticed that the language totally shifts, and the way that he speaks to the parents and to the teachers is a little bit harsher and more severe in terms of how to speak to children. And then when he actually speaks to the children, it's a very soft, loving tone in terms of addressing the child. And then the third section is an introduction to Kabbalah. As a Hasidic Rebbe, he did hold that was very important in terms of inspiring the next generation, that they should be well-versed in the basics of Kabbalah. This publication, which comes out in the 1930s, is immediately acclaimed throughout Europe. And until today, you could find it's called the Student's Obligation or the Chovas HaTalmidim, many translations and publications. As the war will break out, we'll discuss briefly in a moment, he already is in Warsaw. He had many opportunities to leave Warsaw, to leave the ghetto, and he declined all of them. He wanted to be with his Hasidim, while he encouraged his Hasidim to leave, or anyone for that matter who could get out of Warsaw, get out of the ghetto. He insisted on staying together with his people to the very end. He had numerous opportunities to leave, and he never took any of them. How this piece of work came to us, there's a well-known group known as the Oneg Shabbos. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. The Oneg Shabbos was led by a Jewish historian known as Emanuel Ringelblum. Emanuel Ringelblum, who was a historian, was included in the Warsaw Ghetto and realized that the outside world was never going to know what was taking place inside the ghetto. And he set about, he recruited quite a number of amateur historians. They were known as Zamlers, and most of them did not know about each other. They were all working in secret cells. And they went about recording, documenting everything that they could about the Warsaw Jewish life. They documented the economy, which was a bizarre economy, of course, based on smuggling in of food, which was the basic, that was the greatest asset that a person could have was, of course, food. They documented the economy, they documented religious life, political factions, the resistance, the Jewish police force, Jewish council, everything that went on inside of the ghetto. Rabbi Shimon Huberband, who I referred to earlier this morning, he has a published work, it's a beautiful work called Kiddush Hashem. He was one of the historians. He also was a historian prior, and I mentioned this morning during the keynotes, he lost his wife and his child in the early bombings of the early days of the war. and he set about dedicating the rest of his life to chronicling and whatever he could about that which was going on in the ghetto. As a Rav, he was close with the Rebbe, and it's assumed that he's the one who told the Rebbe about the Oneg Shabbos and their plans to chronicle, document, and keep track of everything. The Rebbe began Rosh Hashanah to chronicle his own drashos that he was giving in the Hasidic world. The primary drush is not Shabbos morning, like it is today in our community, would be Shalosh Shudas time. The Shmuz Shalosh Shudas time was the Shmuz of the Rebbe, and he would then write up after Shabbos. He would write his drasha up, and he would give it to a scribe, and then the scribe would write it in beautiful penmanship, would transcribe whatever the Rebbe had given him from his drasha. We know all about this because at some point the scribe either was deported, died, we don't know what happened, but the Rebbe then eventually, for the back half, did it himself. We only have the original notes of the Rebbe, not in the beautiful penmanship of the scribe, but of the Rebbe's own penmanship. And the Rebbe went over them and clearly annotated, he crossed out, he added throughout the years. He clearly intended it for publication. It wasn't just his note that he should remember what he said, but he would work through it. That's how that went on for 3 years. From the Rebbe began in, as I mentioned, Rosh Hashanah as the Germans, 2 weeks after the Germans invaded Poland. And the last entry I spoke about on Shabbos, the last entry was Shabbos Chazon in July of 1942. It's just almost a full 3 years of drushes that we have. We have about 100 sermons that he recorded. He didn't record every single week that he gave a drasha. Maybe he didn't give a drasha, we don't know. He recorded 100 over the course of the 3 years. He recorded 100 drashas that we have. In the summer of 1942, which is right at the end of his recorded drashas, the deportations to Treblinka increased. The Jewish population of Warsaw had diminished from 500,000 in the ghetto at its peak, which was a ridiculous number of people, human beings in a small area, down to under 60,000 by the summer of 1942. And Ringelblum correctly understood that the end was near for the Jews of Warsaw and set about finalizing their project, which had been going on for a couple of years, and to bury all of the documents that they had gathered over the course of those 3 years. And that's what they did. They buried them in milk cans, 3 different milk cans. They separated them into 3 different locations and buried the various transcripts. The Rebbe gave in his manuscript, which he had been holding on to from his 3 years worth of sermons. He gave them into the Ringelblum Oneg Shabbos archive, and it was buried together with the archives. The Rebbe himself was taken to the Troniki labor camp in November of 1943. He avoided all of the deportations. He was working in some factory. He had, through his stature, he had gotten connections to get a work permit. A number of the Jews in the ghetto were working in certain factories, and he was working in one of them, but that was closed down, and he was deported to the different work camp in Troniki, and the Jews there were all liquidated in November of 1943. The Rebbe had many opportunities, as I mentioned, even in Troniki to leave, but he always refused to do so. He would not leave anyone behind. The milk cans were discovered in 1950, about 5 years after the war ends. A Polish worker was clearing rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto. The Germans eventually, after the Warsaw Uprising, the Germans basically just said enough of this, and they leveled the entire ghetto. They just razed the entire thing to the ground. And about 5 years later, one of the Polish workers was clearing the rubble for a new construction. Warsaw today has been rebuilt, and that process started. And a Polish worker discovered a can. Again, the 3 cans were in 2 different places. They only recovered 2/3 of the milk cans. One of them is still missing. They assume at this point it's been destroyed, but maybe it will turn up. It's been quite a long time, obviously, now, but they found 2/3 of them. And so this Polish worker discovered the milk can and gave it over to, there was some Jewish organization. But as you can imagine, Poland and Warsaw, 5 years after the war, nobody really had a head to work through hundreds of documents in this milk can, and it basically sat in a room somewhere while the Jews were trying to put their lives back together in Poland and the rest of Europe. In 6 years, it sits. After being discovered in 1950, it sits in some agency basement. In 1956, a Jew by the name of Baruch Duvdevani who was survived the war and was currently living in the land of Israel, went to Poland on a mission. Word had gotten out that Oneg Shabbos had buried all of these documents and that the Rebbe had buried his documents amongst them, and nobody knew where they were. And this fellow, this Duvdevani, set out to Poland to find him. And in his asking around, he eventually found out about the milk can which had been discovered, and he got to that, and he sifted through all of the documents, and he found the Rebbe's manuscript. He brought it back to Eretz Yisrael, and it was published in 1960 under the term Eish Kodesh. There are a number of printings. It's all in Hebrew. The Rebbe spoke in Yiddish, but he transcribed everything into Hebrew. He wrote in the classic rabbinic Hebrew language, even though he spoke in Yiddish. That classic rabbinic Hebrew is not modern Hebrew. It's the reason why people like me who speak a weak Hebrew are always embarrassed when you go to Israel, because if an Israeli were to hear a person like me, who I learned Hebrew from Sfarim, it's not modern Hebrew, and it's not street language Hebrew. It sounds almost as if someone on the streets of the U.S. would talk like 15th century British English. So like you'd understand them, but they'd sound pretty funny because nobody really talks that way anymore. So he wrote in modern Hebrew, even though nobody spoke that language in Poland, they spoke Yiddish. He gave his drashos in Yiddish and he wrote it in Hebrew, and that's the way that it has been published. It's been translated into many languages under the title Eish Kodesh. And this is the Piaseczno Rebbe. I'm sure every once in a while you hear stories. That's like the story of the Rebbe's. He titled it Torah Mishnot Hazam. He titled it himself Torah from the Years of Wrath. But it was in 1960 again. It was published under the title Eish Kodesh. Now the work is a classic because it is, I don't want to say the only, but it is. I think it is the only real-time work that we have theological discussions during the war, not from someone who lived in the war, but somewhere else. In the midst of the ghetto, we have Drashot week after week of drashos that were given by the Rebbe, and therefore it is a work unto itself, which is very valuable to historians, to theologians, to understand the Rebbe's train of thought, how it developed from the beginning of the war to wasn't even the end of the year, but the next 3 years. So it's been greatly studied by historians, by scholars, and by Rabbanim alike. It's just an amazing thing. And in recent times, there was one thing missing from the Rebbe's work, which has been published again we've had it for 50 years, since 1960. Nobody ever did a study as to what was going on in the ghetto week by week that led to that drasha. All we have is the drasha of what he said, Parshas Chayei Sarah, 1941. What happened in the ghetto that week that led him to say this? So that we didn't have like an overlay of the history on top of his drasha. 3 years ago, a historian in New York, Henry Abramson, set out to do that, and he published a work. It's a beautiful work. Torah from the Years of Wrath, the historical context of the Eish Kodesh, and he presents week by week what was going on in the ghetto. And now look at the Rebbe's words. When you read the Rebbe's words before, but you didn't know what everybody was thinking about. But now he gave you, this is what was taking place. Now read the Rebbe's words in the mindset of the listeners as to what was going on that particular week, and that would lead him to say this and what he was addressing. The reason why this is so critical, the Rebbe, as I mentioned last night, here as well, almost never mentions the Germans by name, never mentions the Nazis, and he very rarely mentions specific things that were happening. He had a theological approach, and he conveyed it very clearly. This is what all the historians, again, studying his works, to make it very clear in that he didn't want his listeners to feel that they were the individual subjects of this terrible calamity, but that they were Jewish history. They were living through history, and that the Torah's timeless lessons applied in this particular case to them, but it was a global Jewish history issue, not this particular community in this particular time. And so when he discussed ideas, he didn't discuss it as they related to the Jew sitting in front of him, but to Jewish history as a whole in the context of the timeless Torah. So understanding more what was going on is significant because he doesn't always address it very, very specifically. What I'd like to do in this first session now for the next few minutes is to learn three of his drashas. These are some of the first three drashas early in the war. And then in the second session, whether you're here in person or on Zoom, to go through some of the, I don't know later, but later, not the latest, but some of the later drashas that he had, and just to sort of see that which was taking place around him and the way that he addressed them, and sort of a little bit how it developed over time. So let's begin with this very first drasha. I'm going to do this in 5-10 minutes. The Rebbe has a student. The student, of course, never met his Rebbe, but Rav Moshe Weinberger in New York, who's the Rav of a shul called Eish Kodesh. Rav Moshe Weinberger views himself very much as a student, the Talmud of the Rebbe, and so his shul Eish Kodesh, he teaches a lot of Torah from the Eish Kodesh. He has a 2-hour shir on this first drasha. So if it's of interest, you can look it up on YU Torah. Spoke about it a number of times. This Rosh Hashanah drasha. But we'll touch on it a little bit. The historical context of the drasha, before we actually read a few paragraphs from his drasha, we just have 3 paragraphs to learn together, is, as I mentioned, September 1, as you know, 1939, the Germans invade Poland. By September 7, they're on the outskirts of Warsaw. The Polish offered, for various reasons which are not at the topic of our discussion, almost no resistance to the Germans. They were completely overmatched. And by a week later, on September 7th, they're on the outskirts of Warsaw. But for whatever reason, the Germans decided not to invade Warsaw immediately, and they spent a week bombarding Warsaw. Artillery from the planes, bombs. They knocked out the city a little bit before they actually came in, and it took it over. The Polish leadership of Warsaw abandoned the city by the time the Germans surrounded it. They knew that this was their capital city that was next in line to fall. They left. So that the city, the government left, a lot of rabbinic leaders left. Everybody was correctly assumed that anyone of a position of power was going to be the first one to go when the Germans came. So they left. They fled. So you had a city that was now surrounded by Germans. The bombings had not yet begun, were about to begin. And they had just about begun a week later. September 7th is a week before Rosh Hashanah. September 14th is Rosh Hashanah. So try to put yourself into the seat of a Jew, which is, again, this is the seat, the heart of the Jewish community in Warsaw. September 14th, Rosh Hashanah. You've seen the Germans on the outskirts of the city for a week now. You know that they've run through every other Polish town that they've entered into. And now it's Rosh Hashanah, September 14th, 1939. So the Rebbe began with a medrash that records the 3 fast days of the month of Tishrei. There are 3 fast days. The first fast day is actually Erev Rosh Hashanah, which is technically still in Elul. That's a fast day that is not observed by everyone. In fact, it's only observed by the most pious of Jews fast on Erev Rosh Hashanah. The next fast day is right after Rosh Hashanah, Tzom Gedalia. Tzom Gedalia is observed by the Orthodox Jewish community, observes the fast of Tzom Gedalia. It's one of the major, not a major fast, but it's of the minor fast. It's a fast day that's observed amongst the Jewish community. The third fast of Tishrei, of course, happens a week later, and that is Yom Kippur. Everybody fasts on Yom Kippur. Those are the 3 fasts. You have the Erev Rosh Hashanah, which is only by the pious. Tzom Gedalia, a good bulk of the Jewish community observes that fast. And then Yom Kippur, that's already by everybody. The Medrash then, it begins, we'll read together on the top of your sheet, this is the Rebbe's words translated into English. A city owed taxes to the king. This is really, he's quoting still from the Medrash here. So the city owes taxes. Now in those days, when you sent out collectors, the collectors had a lot of authority to administer a lot of damage to those who didn't want to pay their taxes. As the tax collectors approached within 10 mil of the city, let's just call it 10 miles outside of the city, the local dignitaries went out and paid homage to the king, and the collectors waived a third of the taxes. This is a medrash. So as the collectors are coming, everybody's afraid of the collectors. So the leaders, the dignitaries go out and they give great honor to the tax collectors. You guys are so amazing and so on. And the tax collectors, okay, we'll forgive a third of the taxes. At a distance of 5 miles away, the middle level authorities went out and paid homage to the king, and the collectors waived another third. When they drew close to the city, then men, women, and children, everybody came out to pay homage to the king, and the collectors waived the remaining third. That's the Medrash. What is the Medrash's message? The Medrash concludes and says, so too, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the great ones of the generation fast. Rosh Hashanah, of course, is Kiva HaMelech. The king is coming on Rosh Hashanah. The presence of the king is felt on Rosh Hashanah like no other day. So on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the special dignitaries, the great ones of the generation fast. The Holy One, blessed is he, waives a third of their sins. And then the day after Rosh Hashanah, Tzom Gedalia, the mid-level people, Jews, fast, and the king waives another third of their sins. Then on Yom Kippur, everybody comes out to pay homage to the king, and the king waives the remaining third. That's the medrash that the Rebbe began his Rosh Hashanah drasha with. Now, if you were sitting in the pews, listening to the Rebbe speak about the tax collector coming to town and going out to pay homage to the king, so without any historical context, what's he talking about? Your city is surrounded. Your city is surrounded by Germans, and the leadership has left the city. So you are a leaderless, frightened, defenseless city, surrounded by the tax collector, so to speak, and who knows what they will do when they enter in. The Rebbe then took this into the concept of fear. It would be clear without knowing anything else other than what we've just shared. Every single Jew sitting in their seat trembled that Rosh Hashanah like they had never trembled before. It's unimaginable sitting in what that davening would have been like inside the city of Warsaw, surrounded by the Germans. And so the Rebbe spoke about fear. He said the essence of fear is derived from the greatness of God. Listen to the way that he's going to take this concept. Every Jewish soul feels this, each person according to his ability. So the recognizing the greatness of Hashem's presence will net the result of fear within the individual Jew. Thus, whereas one person might feel within himself the fear of the greatness and holiness of God and tremble with the thought, heaven forbid, of sinning against God, another person might merely feel the fear of punishment. Without getting into too great depth here, there are two levels of fear. We talk about fear of Hashem. There's a fear of punishments and the fear of the greatness of God himself. Those are two different levels. The lower level, which halavai, we should all be on the lower level, is that we fear punishments. That's the lowest level. Why do we do the right? What drives us to do that which is correct and not do that which we're not? We're afraid. We don't want to get punished. That's the low. Halavai, we should all have that. Not every person has such a fear. Halavai, the higher level is a fear of the greatness of Hashem's presence itself. So the Rebbe speaks about where does that come from? And fear is derived from the essence of Hashem himself. The brackets are actually a comment from Henry Abramson in his book, who comments at this point that the Rebbe then introduces a parable which permeates much of his written works, which is the plight of the prince in captivity. The idea that the prince has been sent out from his home, from the palace, yearning to be reunited with his father, the king. Now, the Rebbe, of course, was orphaned as a very young child. He was only 3 years old. But he brings this parable. He concludes his sermon, his drasha, as follows. He quotes the parable. A prince is held captive among wanton people who torment him. So again, you should many drashas, like all the classic rabbinic parables. There once was a king who exiled his son from the palace. They have a prince, he's exiled, and he's being tormented by those who have captured him. When he suddenly senses that the king is close by, he begins to shriek bitterly, "Save me, my father, save me, my king." He cries because he senses that the king is near. The intensification of his plaintive cries is an indication of the king's greater proximity. As he senses the king is closer and closer, calls out, "Save me, Father, Abba, you're close." So too, when a Jew is brokenhearted, whether over his own troubles, the suffering of his loved ones, or for Jewry as a whole, is a sign that he senses the revelation of the sovereignty of Hashem. Think about the message that he's saying here for a moment. He's talking to people who are frightful, afraid for their lives and for good cause. And what does he do with that fear that they're feeling? He channels it into, this is the essence of Rosh Hashanah. When a Jew feels Hashem is close, the fear that he has, he channels the proximity that he senses the king is near him. The king is close by, and he calls out, "Save me, my father, save me, my king," which of course is what phrase, "Save me, my father, save me, my king," is Avinu Malkeinu, which is the essence of the Yomim Noram, which they were about to enter into. He knows everybody is afraid, and he tries to channel that fear into a platform of growth. And when a Jew feels his king is close, that fear is overwhelming to call out, to be dependent on the intensification of his fear of the Blessed One and his repentant desire to coronate the Blessed One as his king. Use this to be Mamlech Hashem as your king is Rosh Hashanah. This is before anything has happened. And you could almost see, I don't know what the drasha would have been had he known what was going to happen, but this is still before anything has happened. And it's a sense of strength. Use the fear of that which is the tax collector coming, that we should all go out to pay homage to the king, to recognize the king, to channel that fear into the broken-hearted sense of the Jew, to cry, save me, my father. And that is the essence of Rosh Hashanah. I mentioned this morning that right after Yom Kippur, as the bombings begin, the Rebbe's only son was mortally wounded in the bombing. Right after 2 days after Yom Kippur on Yud Beis Tishrei is when the bombing took place. The injury took place standing right near the Rebbe in their own home. They rushed him to various hospitals. They couldn't find the hospital to get him into. Eventually, they got him into a hospital. And then again, without going into this, I said this morning. 2 days later, the bombings continued on the second day of Shavuos, and the Rebbe's daughter-in-law, his son's wife, together with her father, were standing outside of the hospital when the bombings commenced. And they were killed in that next series of bombings while the Rebbe was out somewhere else trying to get a private doctor to come and help him. So the Rebbe survived the second bombing, but then his son died from his wounds on the second day of Sukkot. So in between this first drasha that we just read, as the Germans are simply surrounding the city, 2 weeks later, by the time the second day of Shavuos ends, within those 2 weeks' time, he lost his son, his daughter-in-law, and his mechutin, all died in the bombings, together with a great number of Jews in the city of Warsaw. The Rebbe goes silent. We don't have another drasha from him for 6 weeks from the time, of this first Rosh Hashanah drasha until November 4th, Parshas Chayesar. During the time where he suffered all of that personal loss, we don't hear from him. But the first words that he shares in November, so that's a typo, it's 1939, not 1943. In November of 1933, in Parshas Chayesara, he talks about the death of Sarah Imenu, as Chayesara begins. So before, again, I mentioned that background just in terms of understanding what was going on. These are the first words that he has shared publicly since, or at least that he recorded for us, since their death. And he quotes the work Ma'or Vashemesh in the name of the holy man of God, the Maharam Mendel of Rimanov, one of the famous Hasidic Rebbes, who says as follows: the Gemara, Rav Mendel, Menachem Mendel of Rimanov, is commenting on a piece from Gemara. The Gemara says that there's a covenant of bris with Melech, which is really based on a pasuk. And what is the covenant the Gemara says with Melech? A similar covenant is made with Yisurim, with afflictions. And the Gemara connects Melech and afflictions, that just as salt makes meat palatable, to eat without any salt is bland, it doesn't have a taste, there's no time to it. So too afflictions purify the individual of sin. That's the Gemara, that there's a bris Melech, a bris Yisurin, and in the same way that Melech helps meat, afflictions, Yisurin, help individuals by purifying them of their sin. Rav Menachem Mendel of Rimanov then added to that and said, just as one cannot derive pleasure from meat that has been excessively salted, even though salt gives ta'am, but there's too much, you could say, can't eat it, it's too salty. Without any salt, it's bland. With too much salt, I can't take it. So the Rebbe from Rimanov said, so too, afflictions, Yisurin, should be meted out only in such measure that they can be tolerated with an admixture of mercy. Can't have too many Yisurin either, the Rebbe said. Too much, can't take it. Just like salt has to be the right amount, you can only take the right amount of Yisurin. Now, the Rebbe Eish Kodesh is going to make a comment on this in the way that he's going to apply this rule that you can't have too many afflictions, not too many Yisurim, you can't take it. And the Rebbe comments, he's darshaning Parshas Chayesara. So Chayesara, Rashi opens up the Parsha by saying what happened right before Parshas Chayesara. Chayesara opens with the death of Sarah Imenu. What happened right prior in the end of Parshas Vayera, before Parshas Chayei Sarah? What do we read about? Okay, this Yitzchak. So Rashi comments, why is the death of Sarah mentioned right after the binding of Yitzchak? So Rashi says that when Sarah Imenu heard the news that her son was being bound and was about to be sacrificed, her soul burst forth from her body and she died. That's what Rashi says. When she heard, her soul died. The Rebbe then comments that Moshe Rabbeinu, the faithful shepherd, the Roya Ne'eman, juxtaposed the death of Sarah to the binding of Yitzchak. That Moshe, so to speak, put together, again, Moshe is transcribing what Hashem tells him, but he puts it in the context as if Moshe decided to put Sarah's death right next to the Akedas Yitzchak in order to advocate for us, for all history, that this should be Sarah speaking on our behalf, indicating what results from excessive afflictions, heaven forbid, her soul bursts forth. The historians and the scholars take this piece apart. There's a very fascinating piece that he's saying. As if the Torah and Rashi are quoting for us, it's a message to the Ribbon Shalom. This is the Rebbe speaking, so to speak, Hashem himself saying, do you remember what happened with Sarah? Remember what happened when you gave her afflictions beyond what she could take? Harcha nishma, so she couldn't live. Furthermore, he says, this is what happened with the righteous Sarah, the tzaddik Sarah Imenu, who was as blameless, as free from sin at the age of 100 as a 20-year-old, and all her years were equally good, yet she was unable to withstand such horrible afflictions. How much more so does this apply to us? These are his first recorded words since the death of his own son, his only son, his daughter-in-law, his mechutin. Now, many of the commentators point out, this is parenthetical, that when you learn about that Rashi, what do you mean that Sarah made she couldn't handle it? If Hashem was mitzvah Avram to offer a son, why does Sarah die? And many commentators point out this wasn't Sarah's nisayon, it was Avram's nisayon. Avram's nisayon, Yitzchak's nisayon. Sarah maybe was never supposed to find out about it, but when Rashi quotes, when the Malachim came and they said to Sarah, you know what's happening? She died, she couldn't handle it. So the Rebbe uses that and says, you could almost hear in his words, now he's speaking to people who have all suffered terrible losses, and it's as if he's claiming against the Rebbe Shalom himself, if you afflict us too much, we can't handle it. Sarah Imenu couldn't handle it. How are we supposed to handle these terrible afflictions? He then added later, an addendum that he added sometime later, we don't know exactly when he added it, and it's also possible to argue that Sarah Imenu was so heartbroken from the binding of Yitzchak that her soul burst forth, and she did so for the benefit of the Jewish people. Again, he's darshaning, it's as if Sarah willingly gave up her life on behalf of the Jews who would suffer terribly hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, to demonstrate to Hashem how it's impossible for us to tolerate excessive afflictions. As if she gave up her life to say, Ribbon Shalom, we can't take it. I can't take it, Sarah. I'm giving up my life to show that this is too much. Even for one who remains alive after such afflictions by the grace of God. Nevertheless, some of his strength, his mind and spirit are broken and destroyed. Speaking from a broken father. The problem is resolved by the verse describing the years, the Chayei Sarah, that it seemed that she may have sinned by forsaking the remaining years of her life. The way that he's understanding it is if she delivered a message to Hashem by giving up her life to say, I can't handle this. Had she had not chosen to be so heartbroken over the binding of Yitzchak, maybe she could have lived. However, she forsook them for the benefits of the Jewish people. That is to say that even those years beyond her 127 would have been equally good, and forsaking them did not constitute a sin on her part. She gave up her life as a message to the Rebbe Shalom, we can't take it. We can't take it. These are the first message that he recorded after the death of his immediate family. I want to do one more now, from just a few weeks after that, in November of 1939. Parshas told us the very next week. What had happened historically, as Dr. Abramson records, in between the 6 weeks of the Rosh Hashanah when the Germans were on the outskirts, November 4th, where they had entered the city, by November 11th, they had already basically begun their process of humiliating the Jews in the streets. And he records stories. I'll just read one quick one from which Abramson records from Huberband's records of that which was taking place in the ghetto.
November 4 is 4 years later.
What's that?
In November 4.
39. 39. It's just a little typo.
It should be 39.
39. Yeah, 39. Wait, I lost it. Here it is. 2 other Jews were seized along with us, one with a black beard and the other with a long yellowish beard. A moment later, they grabbed an elegantly dressed young lady and forced her to shear off my beard and Steyer's beard as well. The girl wept as she cut our hair for the honor of the Jewish people, which was being disgraced in public by the evil ones. These barbarities were done not only to grown men, but to also children with payas. In Praga, a group of German officers chanced upon a 10-year-old Avram Igelnik at the gates, and he gives the address. They took him away to their headquarters where they set fire to his payas. The young boy was lucky to have been left alive. The beginning of the war, over the course of the war, the German atrocities got worse and worse as the final solution began. But it began with these atrocities, and then as things progressed, worse and worse. So as this was beginning to spread through the ghetto, the Rebbe's Drashot on Parshas told us the following week, he begins with a pasuk, Uva uvdin me'eretz Ashur. This is the pasuk which is going to describe the ingathering of the exiles. Uva uvdin, those who are lost will be gathered me'eretz Ashur, from the land of Assyria. V'hanidachim me'eretz Mitzrayim. Those dispersed from Mitzrayim are all going to be gathered together. The Rebbe was bothered. Why does the Torah describe 2 different types of Jews? One who is ovdim, one who is lost in Assyria, and those who are dispersed in Mitzrayim. What's the difference between being lost and between being dispersed? So the Rebbe writes here in the paragraph on the second side here, in November 11, there are 2 distinct categories: those who are lost and those who are dispersed. The dispersed refers to the one who is displaced, but to a different locale. He remains distinct and recognizable. So he is who he is. You know who he is. You can recognize who he is. He's just been dispersed. He used to live here, and now he's been moved somewhere else. That's somebody who's dispersed. That is in contradistinction to somebody who's lost. Ha'ovdim be'eretz Ashur. Someone who is lost is neither distinct nor recognizable. Can't even tell what he looks like anymore. For when the hardships are presently so compounded that they even cut off the beards of Jews and make them outwardly unrecognizable, and due to the unimaginable persecution and unbearable afflictions, they are no longer recognizable internally, such a person loses himself. He ceases to recognize himself. How did he feel a year ago, Shabbos? On a weekday before he would go to daven? He doesn't even recognize who he is. He is now trampled and crushed so that he is no longer sensed as if he is a Jew or not, a human being or not, or an animal which has no capacity to feel. This is the nature of one who is lost, yet they will come to, they will come home, those who are lost. Put yourself again back in the pews in November, Warsaw, 1939, and the person sitting next to you has had his beard shaven off in a humiliating manner the week before. And now he sits there, a chassid without his beard, a child without their payas. And he feels humiliated. He feels lost. And the Rebbe speaks to him and says, Uva ovdim me'eretz Ashur. When Hashem gathers us together, this is again the beginning of it's November. It's 3 weeks into not even 3 months into the war. No one knows what's coming. And he's talking to a group of Jews, humiliated, embarrassed, not sure they can show their face in shul even. And he says there are 2 categories of Jew who's going to be redeemed. The Jew who's dispersed, who's recognizable, who looks the same, he just is forced to live somewhere else. And the Jew who is lost. What does it mean to be a Jew who's lost? Where you become so unrecognizable, we don't recognize you. What happened to you? And one can imagine how that you felt. That you felt a chassid without his beard. I'm not even a Jew anymore. I don't know if I can daven. I don't know what I can do. So he speaks to that Jew and he says, yes, you feel unrecognizable on the outside and you feel unrecognizable on the inside. But they're all going to be gathered together when the redemption comes. If they would have known, it would be 5 years and the numbers that would be lost. But again, nobody knew that. They're all coming home. He speaks to those sitting in front of him who've had a beard shaven off. And he concludes his drasha. The Gemara says that one who lost something seeks after your lost object. The Gemara talks, who seeks after what? The Gemara puts this in the context of whether or not is it the men who run after the women to get married or the women who run after the men. So the Gemara says it's the men always running after the women. Why is it that men traditionally are running after the women more than the women after the men? The Gemara says because Adam Arishon lost his sailor, lost his rib. So when the person who lost something, he's the one who runs after to find what he's missing. So says the Rebbe, it's always the nature of someone who's lost something. The lost object doesn't seek its owner. The owner seeks after the lost object. When he lost it, it might not any longer be perceptible. It might not be recognizable. And thus the owner seeks to find it, to pick it up and bring it home. Is it not the Ribono Shel Olam, the master of we who are lost? Are we not the lost possessions of our Creator, our Father in heaven? May He come out and find us and gather us together. It's a message of hope. It's hard to read it knowing what we know was coming, but a message to the chassid without his payas, a message to the man who's had his beard shaven off, who's humiliated and embarrassed and feels lost. And the Rebbe says, the master of the world, of whom we belong to, will seek us out, will look after us. Even the ones who are lost and unrecognizable and don't know who they are inside or outside, he's going to come to gather us together and bring us back home. It's amazing to hear the words of strength, the words of hope. It's hard, as I said, it's difficult to read them, knowing what we know was the final result of these unfortunate Jews in the ghetto. Mirz Hashem, we'll stop here. We'll learn a couple of more, both on Zoom, those who want to join in, or those who will be here from some of the later dates as the years continued, as the Rebbe's thought developed of an insight as to what it was like to hear a drasha from the Rebbe inside the Warsaw Ghetto. Right.